When the most helpful species in the galaxy suddenly goes silent, every empire realizes too late how much they depended on humanity's voice, and what happens when that voice refuses to speak. The Galactic Council chamber had never been so quiet. Ambassador. Zekthor of the Vraxian hegemony shifted uncomfortably in his gravitational suspension field. His 6 compound eyes focused on the empty platform at the center of the vast amphitheater. Around him, representatives from 473 species waited in an unusual state of collective anxiety. The air recyclers hummed their eternal song, but even that mechanical rhythm seemed subdued, as though the station itself sensed the gravity of what was about to unfold, or rather, what was about to not unfold. For the first time in 32 standard cycles, the human delegation was not speaking. Zekthor had been present at humanity's introduction to the Galactic Council 17 years ago. He remembered the enthusiasm, the endless questions, the way the human ambassador, a woman named Chen, if memory served, had peppered every session with inquiries about galactic law, trade regulations, cultural exchange protocols. Humans had been overwhelming in their eagerness to participate, to learn, to contribute. Some species had found it exhausting. Zekthor had found it refreshing. But 3 weeks ago, something had changed. The human delegation had arrived at the quarterly summit as scheduled. They had taken their seats in the Sol Sector observation pods. They had registered their presence in the official records. And then, when the session began, they had simply declined to speak. Not dramatically, not with any obvious hostility. Ambassador Rodriguez had merely stood when recognized, offered a polite bow, and stated in clear, measured tones, "The Terran Federation respectfully declines to comment at this time." That had been 21 days ago. 21 days of humans attending every session, every committee meeting, every trade negotiation. 21 days of them sitting silently, taking notes, nodding politely when addressed. 21 days of them offering nothing, no opinions, no proposals, no objections, no support, just silence. And in that silence, something unprecedented had happened to the Galactic Council. It had begun to realize how much it had come to depend on humanity's voice. The first casualty had been the Draken-Sithari territorial dispute. For 3 generations, these 2 species had been locked in bitter disagreement over a mineral-rich asteroid belt on the edge of their shared border. Every decade, the conflict would flare up, threatening to spiral into open warfare. And every time, the Council had struggled to find a resolution that both parties could accept. Last year, Ambassador Rodriguez had proposed a solution so elegant in its simplicity that Zekthor still marveled at it. A joint mining operation with profits split based on volumetric extraction rates rather than territorial claims. The Drakens and Sithari had agreed within hours, ending a century-old feud with a handshake and a contract. The humans had even provided the initial technical expertise to set up the operation, asking for nothing in return except goodwill and future friendship. This year, with the operational details up for review, and both species already bickering over implementation specifics, the Council had turned expectantly to the human delegation. Ambassador Rodriguez had stood, bowed, and offered her now familiar refrain. The Terran Federation respectfully declines to comment at this time. The Draken and Sithari representatives had stared at her in disbelief. Then they had stared at each other. The session had ended in acrimonious deadlock. That had been the first crack in the dam. Council Director Tom Baj, a crystalline whose species had led the Council for the past 2,000 years, called an emergency session of the Executive Committee. Zekthor attended as the Vraxian representative, along with delegates from the other 11 founding species. "We need to address the human situation." Tom Baj's voice resonated through the chamber, his crystalline body refracting light in agitated patterns. "Their silence is becoming problematic." Problematic. Council member Zyth of the Aqueous Collective let out a burbling laugh. "Is that what we're calling it? 3 weeks without human intervention, and half the Council's active negotiations have collapsed. The Meridian Trade Consortium is on the verge of civil war. The Outer Rim Security Pact is dissolving." "We are aware of the situations," Tom Baz interrupted, his light patterns sharpening. "The question is why? What provoked this response from humanity?" Silence fell over the committee. Zekthor felt his mandibles click nervously. He knew the answer. They all knew the answer. They just didn't want to admit it. It had been the Korgathi incident. 6 weeks ago, a human cargo vessel civilian, unarmed, carrying agricultural supplies to a colony world, had been seized by Korgathi raiders in the neutral zone. The crew of 43 had been taken hostage. The Korgathi had demanded ransom, 10,000 metric tons of processed titanium, or the crew would be sold into the slave markets of the outer reaches. Humanity had brought the matter before the Council, invoking the Treaty of Safe Passage that was supposed to protect civilian vessels in neutral space. Ambassador Rodriguez had presented the case with her usual thoroughness, documented evidence, testimony from surviving crew members who had escaped, even tracking data showing the Korgathi ships operating from within Council-protected space. The vote should have been straightforward. The Treaty of Safe Passage was foundational law, one of the oldest and most sacred edicts of the Council. Violation carried severe penalties up to, and including expulsion and economic sanctions. But the Korgathi Dominion was powerful. They controlled 3 major hyperspace lanes and held significant mining interests in 12 sectors. More importantly, they had ally species who depended on Korgathi trade or who feared Korgathi military might. When the vote was called, it had failed. 37 votes in favor of intervention, 42 against, and 194 abstentions. Zekthor had abstained. He wasn't proud of it, but the Vraxian hegemony had significant trade agreements with Korgathi-aligned worlds. His government had sent explicit instructions: do not jeopardize economic interests over a human dispute. He remembered Ambassador Rodriguez's face as the vote was tallied. She hadn't shouted, hadn't protested. She had simply stood, thanked the Council for their time, and returned to her seat. The next day, humanity had paid the ransom through private channels. Their crew members had been returned. The Korgathi had gone unpunished, and at the following session, when humanity was called upon to mediate the latest crisis, Zekthor couldn't even remember what it had been. Ambassador Rodriguez had stood and delivered her first decline to comment. "They feel betrayed," Zekthor said quietly, breaking the uncomfortable silence in the executive committee chamber. "We failed to uphold our own laws when it mattered to them. Now they're wondering why they should continue to uphold Council interests when we've demonstrated that power matters more than principle." Tambaj's light patterns dimmed. "That's a harsh assessment. Is it inaccurate?" No one answered. Council member Varix of the Themarian Concord, whose species prided themselves on diplomatic insight, spoke carefully. "Perhaps we should consider what humanity has actually contributed to the Council since their arrival. It might help us understand the scope of this silence." "An excellent idea," Tambaj agreed, seeming relieved to focus on something concrete. "I'll have the administrative AI compile a report." The report was delivered 6 hours later. Zekthor read it in his quarters, and with each passing page, his sense of unease grew into something approaching dread. The report was titled simply, "Human Contributions to Galactic Council Operations, a 17-year analysis." Zekthor had expected it to be substantial. He had not expected it to be 3,000 pages long. The executive summary alone was damning. Since joining the Galactic Council 17 standard years ago, the Terran Federation has participated in or facilitated the resolution of 1,247 disputes, conflicts, and negotiations. Of these, 892 were considered intractable issues that had persisted for more than one standard cycle before human intervention. Success rate, 87.3%. Human delegates have served on 634 committees, councils, and working groups, including 23 high-level security positions and 89 economic advisory roles. Performance reviews indicate exceptional ratings in 91% of assignments. The Terran Federation has provided technological assistance to 147 species, medical aid to 89 worlds, agricultural expertise to 203 colonies, and educational resources to 412 developing civilizations. Total estimated value of aid provided, 847 trillion galactic credits. Aid received in return, 23 trillion galactic credits. Human voting patterns show consistent support for Council initiatives regardless of immediate benefit to the Terran Federation. Correlation between human votes and objective Council interests, 94.7%. Average correlation for other member species, 34.2%. The summary continued for 23 pages. The detailed breakdown was worse. Zekthor found himself reading through case after case where human ingenuity, human mediation, or simple human persistence had solved problems that had plagued the Council for generations. The Threlkian food shortage resolved by human agricultural engineers who had developed a crop variant that could grow in Threlkian soil. The Outer Rim refugee crisis managed by human logistics coordinators who had somehow housed 4 million displaced persons across 80 worlds with unprecedented efficiency. The Great Plague of Sector 447 contained by human medical researchers who had worked without sleep for 6 days straight to develop a treatment protocol. On and on it went. Hundreds of crises, large and small, that humanity had helped resolve. Not because they had to, not because they were paid, but because, as Ambassador Chen had said in one of her early speeches to the Council, we believe that civilization means helping one another. That's what makes us civilized, Zek. Thor reached the section on current ongoing issues, the matters that were now languishing without human input, and felt his respiratory spiracles contract, the Meridian trade. Consortium was indeed on the verge of civil war, just as Zith had said. 3 member species were threatening secession over tariff disputes that had been peacefully managed for the past decade through a human-designed automated arbitration system. But the system required periodic updates and adjustments, work that had been done by human economic advisors. Without those adjustments, the system had become rigid, unable to accommodate changing circumstances. The consortium members were now blaming each other for manipulating the system, and diplomatic relations had deteriorated to the point where military mobilization had been authorized. The Outer Rim Security Pact was dissolving because its command structure had been designed by human military strategists who understood how to balance the interests of 17 different species with wildly different combat doctrines. Without human coordinators to mediate disputes and optimize operations, the pact had fractured along old ethnic and territorial lines. The list went on, and on and on. By the ancestors, Zekthor whispered to himself, his translator rendering the Vraxian epithet into standard. We didn't just rely on them. We built our entire modern council infrastructure around their participation. His communication console chimed. It was a summons from Tombaj. Emergency Executive Committee meeting in 1 hour. Attendance mandatory. When Zekthor arrived at the chamber, he found it already packed. Not just the Executive Committee, but dozens of other delegates who had apparently insisted on being present. The atmosphere was electric with anxiety. Tombaj's crystalline form was pulsing in rapid, discordant patterns, a sign of deep agitation in his species. We have a crisis, he announced without preamble. The Korgathi Dominion has just seized another human vessel. 300 crew members this time. They're demanding triple the previous ransom. Horrified silence. They know, someone said. Zekthor thought it might have been Varix. They know humanity has lost faith in council protection. They know we won't intervene, so they're exploiting it. It gets worse, Tombaj said, his light patterns dimming to near darkness. 7 other raider groups have announced their intention to follow the Korgathi example. Not just against human ships, against any species they believe the Council won't protect. The Treaty of Safe Passage is effectively dead. They're calling it the Council Protection Paradox. If the Council won't enforce its own laws when it's politically inconvenient, then its laws have no real authority. Zekthor felt ice crystallize in his circulatory system. The Treaty of Safe Passage had been in place for 3,000 years. It was the foundation of interstellar commerce, the bedrock upon which the entire galactic economy rested. If it collapsed, how long until Council space trade routes become too dangerous to use? Someone asked. The shipping consortiums estimate 6 weeks, Tombaj replied. After that, insurance costs will become prohibitive for any civilian vessel. Military escorts will be required for all shipments, which will increase costs by an average of 400%. Small and mid-size economies will be devastated. Trade wars will likely follow. Some projections suggest a cascade into general conflict within 6 standard months. All because we wouldn't punish the Korgathi for seizing 1 human ship, Zith said, her voice heavy with something that might have been regret or might have been accusation. What are the humans doing about this new seizure? Someone asked. Nothing, Tombaj said. They've acknowledged the incident in official communications, but have made no requests for council intervention. No speeches, no votes, no proposals, nothing. They're silent. 3 days later, Zekthor was reviewing intelligence reports when his console chimed with an urgent message from Vraxian High Command. The contents made his mandibles lock in shock. The Terran Federation had mobilized its fleet. Not just a few ships, not a patrol squadron or a defense force. The entire human military, every battleship, carrier, cruiser, destroyer, and frigate in the Terran arsenal had departed their home ports and was moving toward the neutral zone, toward Korgathi space. Zekthor accessed the Council's long-range sensor network. The display filled with blue icons representing human vessels. There were thousands of them, moving in perfect formation like a school of predatory fish converging on wounded prey. His console chimed again. Another message, this time from the Council. All delegates were to report immediately to the main chamber for an emergency session. The chamber was chaos when he arrived. Delegates were shouting at each other in a dozen languages, the translators struggling to keep up. At the center of it all, Ambassador Rodriguez sat quietly in the human delegation pod, her hands folded on her lap, her expression serene. Tombaz was struggling to restore order. "Delegates, please! We must address, the humans are going to start a war." That was the Korgathi representative, High Commander Drexath, his scaled face flushed with what might have been anger or fear.
"They're violating the Neutral Zone Treaty."
"They're threatening sovereign Korgathi territory." "Are they?" Varix's voice cut through the noise. "According to the navigation data, the human fleet has not crossed into Korgathi territory. They're positioned precisely at the treaty boundary. Their intention is obvious." "Is it?" Varix turned to look at the human delegation pod. "Perhaps we should ask. Ambassador Rodriguez, would you care to clarify your Federation's intentions?" All eyes turned to the human ambassador. She stood slowly, gracefully, and walked to the speaker's platform. The chamber fell silent. "The Terran Federation," she said in a clear, calm voice, "respectfully declines to comment at this time." She bowed and returned to her seat. The chamber erupted. "This is unacceptable." Drexath roared. "We demand an explanation." "We demand, you demand?" Scythe's burbling laugh was devoid of humor. "That's rich coming from you. 6 weeks ago, you seized a human civilian vessel. You took their people hostage. You violated the Treaty of Safe Passage, a treaty that has protected all of us for 3 millennia. And when humanity brought the matter before this council, when they asked us to uphold our own laws, what did we do?" Drexath's mouth snapped shut. "We did nothing," Scythe continued, her voice hardening. "We abstained. We looked away. We decided that politics and economics were more important than justice. And now, when humanity decides to take matters into their own hands, you demand answers? You demand protection?" "The Council. The Council has no moral authority here," Varix interrupted. "We forfeited it when we failed to act." Zekthor watched the exchange with growing horror. The Council was fracturing before his eyes, old alliances crumbling, new fault lines forming, and through it all, Ambassador Rodriguez sat quietly, watching, saying nothing. But she didn't need to say anything. Her silence spoke volumes. Over the next 4 days, the situation deteriorated rapidly. The human fleet remained at the neutral zone boundary, not attacking, not retreating, just waiting, like a sword held over the Korgathi's collective head. And in that time, something remarkable happened. The Draken and Sithari, unable to resolve their mining dispute, and fearful that the collapse of Council authority would lead to open warfare, reopened direct negotiations. Without human mediation, it took them 72 hours of bitter argument, but they eventually reached a compromise. Not as elegant as the human solution, but functional. The Meridian Trade Consortium, staring down the barrel of civil war, convened an emergency summit. Their economists worked around the clock to update the arbitration system. It wasn't perfect, they lacked humanity's sophisticated algorithmic approach, but it was enough to pull 3 species back from the brink. The Outer Rim Security Pact reformed under new leadership, species learning to coordinate their military operations without human guidance. It was messy and inefficient, but it worked. One by one, the Council's crises were addressed. Not resolved, not in the clean, efficient way humanity would have managed them, but addressed nonetheless. The galaxy was learning to function without human support. But the lesson came at a terrible cost. Without the stabilizing presence of human mediation, old rivalries resurfaced. 3 minor conflicts erupted in distant sectors. Trade revenues dropped by 18% as shipping routes were rerouted away from dangerous areas. Council sessions became heated arguments rather than productive negotiations. And through it all, the human fleet waited. On the 7th day of the crisis, Zekthor received a private communication from Ambassador Rodriguez. It was brief. Representative Zekthor, the Terran Federation requests a private meeting with members of the Executive Committee. We believe it's time to talk. The meeting was held in a secure conference room, just the 12 Executive Committee members and Ambassador Rodriguez. Tambaj opened the proceedings with characteristic directness. Ambassador, your fleet has been positioned at the neutral zone boundary for a week. The Korgathi still hold your people hostage. The Council is in disarray. What exactly does humanity want? Rodriguez was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was gentle, almost sad. What do we want? We want the Council to remember what it was supposed to be. She activated a holographic display. It showed the Council's founding charter, the document signed by the original 12 species over 3,000 years ago. We, the gathered civilizations of the galaxy, she read aloud, do hereby commit ourselves to the principles of justice, mutual prosperity, and the peaceful resolution of conflict. We recognize that civilization itself depends upon the rule of law that applies equally to the weak and the powerful, law that is enforced with consistency and courage, law that serves the common good rather than narrow interests. She looked around the room. Tell me, when you voted on the Korgathi matter 6 weeks ago, were you thinking about justice, about the rule of law, or were you thinking about trade agreements and political convenience? Silence. I'll tell you what we were thinking, Rodriguez continued. We were thinking that we had made a mistake. Not in joining the Council, we still believe in its potential, but in assuming that our values were shared. We thought that by contributing, by helping, by demonstrating what civilization could look like when people actually cared about doing what was right, we could inspire others to do the same. You did inspire us, Varric said quietly. That's why this has been so painful. You held up a mirror and we didn't like what we saw reflected back. Rodriguez nodded. The human fleet isn't there to start a war, Council member Drexath. We've been very careful not to violate any treaties. But we're also not going to pay another ransom. We're not going to reward piracy. We're not going to pretend that the Treaty of Safe Passage still has meaning when the Council won't enforce it. So what happens now? Tambaz asked. Do you invade Korgathi space? Do you rescue your people by force? We don't want to, Rodriguez said. War should always be the last resort, but we also can't keep subsidizing a system that takes our help while ignoring our rights. So here's what humanity proposes. We'll step back. We'll let the Council learn to function without us. When you're ready, when you've proven that you can uphold your own principles, enforce your own laws, protect the weak as well as the powerful, then we'll return to full participation. And your people being held by the Korgathi? Drexath demanded. You'd abandon them? We would never abandon them. Rodriguez's voice hardened. Right now the Korgathi Dominion has a choice. They can release our people unharmed and face sanctions proportional to their crime, or they can harm our people and discover what humanity looks like when we stop being diplomatic. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. That sounds like a threat. Drexath hissed. It's a statement of fact, Rodriguez replied calmly. Humanity doesn't start fights, High Commander. But we finish them. And unlike some species, we don't need Council approval to protect our own. We would prefer to work within the system. We believe in the system, but if the system won't work, we'll operate outside it. Zekthor spoke for the first time. What you're describing could tear the Council apart. The Council is already tearing itself apart, Rodriguez countered. You've seen it this past week. Without someone to mediate your disputes, you default to tribalism and self-interest. The question isn't whether the Council will survive humanity's silence. The question is whether the Council can survive its own corruption. That's harsh, Tambaj said. Is it inaccurate? Rodriguez echoed Zekthor's words from the earlier Executive Committee meeting. No one answered. Rodriguez sighed. Look, we understand. Politics is complicated. Economics is important. Every species has to look after its own interests. But there has to be a line. There have to be principles that can't be compromised, not even for convenience. The Treaty of Safe Passage is that line. If you won't hold it, civilization itself is at risk. She stood. Humanity will remain silent in Council proceedings until we see evidence that the Council is willing to be what it claims to be. We'll continue our humanitarian aid. We would never punish innocent people for their leaders' failures. But our political participation, our mediation services, our problem-solving, those are reserved for institutions we can trust. And the Korgathi situation? Xuaith asked. We've given the Dominion 48 hours to release our people unharmed and pay restitution for damages. After that, she shrugged. Well, they'll learn why it's a bad idea to take humans hostage. She left the room. The committee sat in stunned silence. The next 24 hours were the most intense period of diplomatic activity in council history. Tambaz called an emergency session. Delegates who had been absent for years showed up in person. The chamber was packed to capacity. We face a choice, Tambaz announced, his crystalline form pulsing in steady, somber patterns. The Korgathi Dominion violated the Treaty of Safe Passage. We failed to act. Humanity has now made it clear that they will not continue to support a council that doesn't uphold its own laws. We must decide what kind of council do we want to be. The debate raged for hours. Some species argued that capitulating to human demands would set a dangerous precedent. Others insisted that humanity was right, that the council had betrayed its foundational principles. Economics were debated. Military implications were discussed. Philosophical treatises on justice and sovereignty were delivered with passionate intensity. Through it all, Ambassador Rodriguez sat silently in the human delegation pod. Watching finally, Zekthor requested the floor. He stood in his gravitational field, feeling the weight of his entire species' economic interests pressing down on him. He thought about the trade agreements with Korgathi-aligned worlds. He thought about the explicit instructions from his government. Then he thought about Ambassador Chen, 17 years ago, asking her endless questions because humans genuinely wanted to understand and help. He thought about the human agricultural engineers who had solved the Threlkian food crisis. He thought about the human medical researchers who had worked without sleep to stop a plague. He thought about every time humanity had helped, expected nothing in return, and been taken for granted. I am authorized by the Vraxian hegemony to change our vote, he said clearly. We support full enforcement of the Treaty of Safe Passage, including all penalties prescribed by council law for the Korgathi Dominion's violations. Furthermore, we propose that the council establish an independent enforcement mechanism, one that cannot be blocked by political considerations, to ensure that our laws apply equally to all members regardless of their power or influence. The chamber erupted in shocked murmurs. One by one, other delegates stood. Ferrix of the Themarian Concord, Scythe of the Aqueous Collective, species after species reversing their previous positions, choosing principle over convenience. When the vote was called, it passed. 419 votes in favor, 31 against, 23 abstentions. The Treaty of Safe Passage would be enforced. The Korgathi would face sanctions, and the Council would establish new mechanisms to ensure that this kind of failure never happened again. In the human delegation pod, Ambassador Rodriguez allowed herself a small smile. The Korgathi released the human hostages within 6 hours of the vote. They paid the restitution. They accepted the sanctions without protest. The human fleet withdrew from the neutral zone boundary and returned to its home ports. But humanity did not immediately return to full council participation. For 3 months, they maintained their silence. They attended sessions. They took notes. They voted when required. But they offered no mediation, no proposals, no solutions to the council's problems, and the council struggled. Without human efficiency, everything took longer. Disputes that would have been resolved in days dragged on for weeks. Economic agreements that would have been streamlined were bogged down in bureaucratic complexity. But slowly, painfully, the council learned. Species that had relied on human mediation learned to talk to each other directly. Delegates who had depended on human problem-solving developed their own solutions. The council became less efficient, perhaps, but more genuinely collaborative. Zekthor watched the transformation with mixed feelings. He missed the ease of human involvement, but he recognized that the council had become dependent in an unhealthy way. They had outsourced their diplomatic heavy lifting to a species that was barely 2 decades into galactic civilization. It had been convenient. It had also been fundamentally unfair. On the first day of the 4th month, Ambassador Rodriguez requested the floor at the opening session. The chamber fell silent. The Terran Federation has observed the Council's progress over the past 3 months, she said. We've seen you enforce your own laws. We've seen you develop new mechanisms for accountability and transparency. We've seen you struggle, yes, but also grow. She paused, looking around the chamber. We believe that the Council is ready to honor the principles in its founding charter. Therefore, humanity is prepared to resume full participation in Council affairs. The chamber burst into applause. Even species that had opposed humanity's tactics seemed relieved. But Rodriguez wasn't finished. However, we want to be clear about the terms of our participation going forward. Humanity will continue to help where we can. We believe in the Council's mission. We believe in galactic civilization. But we will not enable dysfunction. We will not solve problems that you should be solving yourselves. We will not subsidize a system that takes without giving back. She smiled, and there was steel beneath the warmth. Think of us not as fixers, but as partners. We'll work with you, not for you. And if the Council ever again fails to uphold its foundational principles, if convenience is chosen over justice, if the powerful are protected while the weak are abandoned, humanity will not hesitate to step back once more. This silence can always return. The applause was more subdued this time, but more thoughtful, more genuine. Tombaz's crystalline form pulsed in a pattern that Zekthor had learned to recognize as respect. The Council understands, Ambassador Rodriguez, and the Council thanks you not just for returning, but for the difficult lesson you've taught us. We became complacent. We forgot what civilization requires. Constant vigilance, Rodriguez agreed. Constant effort. Constant commitment to being better than our baser instincts. Over the following months, the Council settled into a new normal. Humanity participated actively, but no longer carried the burden alone. Other species stepped up, contributed their own unique strengths, took responsibility for problems in their own regions. The Vraxian hegemony developed a reputation for economic innovation, building on lessons learned from observing human trade practices. The Themerian Concord became master mediators, their diplomatic insights finally given room to shine. The crystalline leadership reformed the Council's administrative systems, creating efficiencies that didn't depend on any one species. The galaxy became more resilient, more genuine, more truly civilized. And when crises arose, because crises always arose, they were handled collaboratively. Sometimes humanity took the lead, sometimes others did. The work was shared, the credit was distributed, and the Council grew stronger for it. 10 years later, Zekthor attended a ceremony at the Council headquarters, commemorating the establishment of the Independent Enforcement Tribunal. The mechanism that ensured Council law was applied equally to all species. Ambassador Rodriguez, now retired and serving as an advisor to the Terran Federation's diplomatic corps, was invited to speak. 10 years ago, she told the assembled delegates, humanity learned an important lesson. Silence can be a powerful tool, but we also learned something else. Silence should never be permanent. Communication, collaboration, community, these are the foundations of civilization, but they only work when everyone is genuinely committed to the same principles. She looked out over the chamber, at the hundreds of species represented there. The Council is not perfect. It never will be. But it is committed to trying, to improving, to being worthy of the faith that its members place in it. That's what matters. Not perfection, but dedication to the pursuit of something better. Zekthor found himself clicking his mandibles in agreement, a gesture that Ambassador Rodriguez had learned to recognize as Vraxian approval. After the ceremony, he approached her. I wanted to thank you, Ambassador. For what? For the lesson. For the patience to teach it without destroying what you were trying to save. That took courage. Rodriguez smiled. Someone once told me that civilization means helping one another. But help doesn't always mean solving people's problems for them. Sometimes the greatest help is stepping back and letting them find their own strength. Who told you that? A Vraxian diplomat, she said, during a late-night conversation about whether the Council was worth saving. He convinced me that it was. Zekthor's mandibles clicked in surprise. He didn't remember that conversation. But then again, 10 years ago had been a chaotic time. The Council is lucky to have had humanity's patience, he said. And humanity is lucky to be part of something larger than itself. Rodriguez replied, We're all better together. We just had to remember how to do together properly. She extended her hand, that peculiar human gesture of partnership and respect. Zekthor touched her palm with his primary manipulator appendage, sealing the sentiment in the universal language of goodwill. Outside the ceremony hall, 1,000 species went about the business of galactic civilization, trading, negotiating, occasionally arguing, but always talking, always communicating, always trying to be worthy of the principles they had committed to 3,000 years ago. And in the silence between words, in the pauses between speeches, in the moments of reflection between crises, they remembered humanity had once declined to speak, and in that silence, the entire galaxy had held its breath. They would not forget that lesson,